who lives in Kosovo and how many people live in Kosovo. This is the million-dollar question. Nobody knows really, because the last population census was conducted in 1981. So for 25 years we don't really know how many people live in Kosovo. So it's all a guess, and it's a question of how informed is the guess. I think the most qualified or educated numbers do assume that there are around 2 million inhabitants of Kosovo, out of which roughly 90% are Kosovo Albanian, and the remainder being minorities or communities as they're called in Kosovo. And that would be just over 100,000 Serbs living in Kosovo, around that area, which would be 5-6%, and then the remainder are Turks, Roma, of course, together with Egyptians in Ashkali, and then other smaller minorities like the Gorani, who live in the Dragaš region, the very southern tip of Kosovo, and Muslims, or Bosniaks as some of them identify themselves. So in that sense you have a very diverse picture, but again it's a relatively small share of the population which is really which belongs to minority communities. There have been serious efforts, of course, of international actors to bring in the Roma community. Especially the OSCE has been more active than the UN, because the OSCE has had a bigger role in working with minorities, developing democratic institutions, and so on. But it's been very hard. I mean, first of all, most Roma and other communities like Egyptians, Ashkali, which are called this awkward acronym of RAE, kind of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians in Kosovo. The problem is most of them had left Kosovo as refugees, so that made it difficult. Many of them fled not only to Serbia but also to Western countries. The ones who left had to flee within Kosovo, and there were problems of registration, many of whom didn't have documentation even from before the conflict, all of which brought about additional problems which made it very hard to really support them. And then, Roma are marginalized everywhere. In the Balkans, if you go to Belgrade, you have terrible mahallas or terrible neighborhoods where Roma live in shanty towns, and that is the status under which Roma live, even if they are not suffering from this kind of post-conflict environment. And of course, and then they're squeezed between Albanians and Serbs in Kosovo, because Albanians have often associated them with having supported Milosevic and having supported the Serbs, while Serbs are happy to point to Roma to give evidence of supposed nationalism among Albanians, but it doesn't translate into genuine care for the Roma community. So in that sense, they might be brought out to justify one argument or another, but they don't really have their own voice. And you have attempts like there's reserved seats in parliament, where a number of seats are reserved for the Roma minority, which means that Kosovo is one of the few parliaments in Southeastern Europe where you have a significant number of Roma represented. But there's no strong tradition of Roma organizations which would really be able to articulate the need of this community and really bring it forth. It is really the economic and social marginalization of this community which is the main challenge. It's not about having an MP in parliament, but it's about access to healthcare, access to education. Most Roma children never go to school, or at least never finish school. And these are the problems which the Roma community faces, and you can only address them at the local level. And that's where you have some international efforts. But it's hard to focus on that, and it's hard to really move on there when unemployment throughout Kosovo is as high as it is. Economic prospects are bad for Albanians, for Serbs, and if they're bad for either of those communities, then they're even worse for Roma. So the worse state Kosovo is altogether, the worse Roma will be as a result. There is a strong indication that the trend of leaving Kosovo is continuing. So you had the double expulsions in a certain way, the expulsion of the Albanian population in 1999 by the Serb forces, and then the expulsion of Serbs and their fleeing Kosovo right at the end of the war, where the Albanians had, of course, nearly 1 million Albanians fled or were forced to flee Kosovo, and then on the Serb side probably another 100,000 Serbs left as well, besides the armed forces and security forces, and with them most Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians as well. So in that sense you had a massive population movement. Now, but these are both movements out of Kosovo, but then you had the movements within Kosovo, where you had this kind of ethnic divide where most Serbs before the war probably lived in urban communities, or good part of them, and nowadays most Serbs live in rural communities because they left the cities, which had an Albanian population majority. So you had a change of geography, but also the kind of circumstances under which people live. All of a sudden, very urban Serbs find themselves in very rural communities in these enclaves. Of course, the biggest controversy in Kosovo is, where do most Serbs live? The prominent discourse in Serbia has claimed that most Serbs live in the north, which is geographically contiguous to Serbia, which is an area which could be annexed and which de facto is already more or less fully integrated into the Serbian state. The other numbers, in particular the research which the European Stability Initiative has done and other organizations, suggest that actually a majority of Serbs don't live in the north but live in enclaves in the south, in areas which are not directly bordering Serbia, in areas which are scattered, where you have couple of villages or sometimes smaller towns which cannot be linked up in kind of neat territorial areas, and where kind of coexistence with Albanian neighbors is required in one way or another, because you cannot get to hospitals, schools, or do your shopping without that. I mean, first of all, many young people especially left in 1999 and before. The out-migration of Serbs is not a trend which began in 1999, but that's something which even continued most likely under Milosevic's most repressive years, and it began before. So in that sense, it's just for the lack of economic perspective, being a minority, being marginalized. Again, the accusation of being discriminated in the 80s was a key source of contention between Albanians and Serbs. So again, it became very politicized, but there's no doubt that Serbs have left Kosovo for decades. So in that sense, it's just a continuation of that trend, for different reasons. But of course, considering that many more have left, it becomes also more difficult to sustain as a community.
Dhe kryeministri i Irakut Ibrahim Al-Gjafari kanë diskutuar për mënyrat e forcimit të forcave të sigurisë së Irakut. Kryeministri britanik Tony Blair dhe kryeministri i Turqisë Recep Tayyip Erdogan diskutuan për ndërsimin e Turqisë në Bashkimin Evropian.
In the beginning, Kosovo Albanians saw the UN as liberator, not the UN as an organization, but the whole package of international forces. I mean, particularly NATO and KFOR were the liberators, while the UN never had such a good image because of its kind of inability to intervene effectively in the 1990s. But still, the whole package was seen very positively by the Albanian community, while most Serbs, for them, it was a dramatic worsening. Everything turned from bad to worse when the international community came in, so very few Serbs had much sympathy for the international community. Now I would say that that image or that kind of perception of the international actors has shifted quite a lot over the last 9 years, because among the Albanian community there's a sense of frustration that has been growing since I would say 2002, 2003 onwards. The sense that the international community doesn't have a plan, doesn't have a strategy, and that it basically is trying to govern over Kosovo against the will of the Albanian community, who would like to govern itself. So this kind of colonial experience is very strong. And also the sense that the lack of certainty that Kosovo will become independent. There was always a disjoint that the international community intervened to prevent massive human rights violations, while the Albanian community wanted the international community to intervene to receive independence. So there were two competing, in a certain way, goals. On one side, prevent human rights violations, the other side, build an independent Kosovo. And that was clashing from the very beginning, because the international actors were very reluctant to accept the logic that Kosovo should be independent, and that brought tensions. And then when you saw the riots in March 2004, although it was targeted against Serbs, if you look at what happened there, international actors were equally targeted, and dozens and hundreds of cars of UN and OSCE were burned, and buildings attacked of international actors. So by that point, for many Albanians, the internationals were no longer the bringers of peace and who brought an end to the Serbian kind of apartheid rule, but rather a colonial force which would hold back the development of Kosovo. This is why you have the whole process of starting to talk about a final status, and that's why you have this whole movement in the international community that this current status is unsustainable, because it's a sense that without a status solution, the international community has to be there indefinitely, and if it's there indefinitely, it will become increasingly targeted by the majority population.